Hello, my friends. I'd like to try something new with you today. Story time with Queen White. I used to read bedtime stories to my son all the time, and I've been encouraged to try it with y'all as I think it's something you might enjoy. I wanted to start with one that I enjoyed when I was a child, and because there's always a child in all of us, right? So this is The Farthest Away Mountain by Lynn Reed Banks. Yes, the same Lynn Reed Banks who wrote The Indian in the Cupboard, though this one was written a little bit earlier, and it's a lot harder to find these days. So I'm going to get a sip of tea first before we get started, because it's a bit of a read. Here we go. A preface. Once upon a time, in a little village that lay in a mountain valley, there lived with her family a girl called Dakin. Her country was beautiful. The air there was so clear that it sparkled in the sunshine as if it were made of diamond dust. Every morning, winter or summer, Dakin could look out of her bedroom window and see the farthest away mountain, its black peak standing up clear of the thick shawl of pine woods it wore on its lower slopes. Between the peak and the woods was a narrower shawl of snow. This snow changed color in a most odd way. Sometimes it was a sharp blue, and sometimes purple, or pink, or even yellow or green. Dakin would watch the snow in great puzzlement, for snow, after all, is supposed to be white. She looked at the pine woods, too. Forest always gave Dakin a shivery feeling, half unease and half excitement. There was no knowing what lay beneath those close-together branches, and no one could tell her, because no one in town, not even her father, who had visited the city and the ocean, had ever been to the farthest away mountain. Old Deagle, the ballad singer and storyteller, who came once a year to bring them news and tales from all over the country, said that the reason no one had ever been to the farthest away mountain was because however long you traveled toward it, it always stayed in the distance. This, he said, was due to a spell that had been placed on it by a magician from their very own village, whose wicked son had disappeared into the mountain long, long ago. But now that you know as much as anyone then knew about the farthest away mountain, I must tell you about Dakin. She is the most important person in the story. Dakin was small and dainty and wore full skirts to her ankles over lots of petticoats, but no shoes, except when it was very cold, and then she wore lace-up boots. She had long hair, so fair as to be almost white. She was supposed to keep it in plaits, but usually she didn't, and it blew out behind her and got tangled. Then her mother would have to brush and comb it for hours to get all the knots out. She had a turned-up nose and eyes the color of the blue mountain flowers that grew in spring, and small brown hands and feet. She was 14. In those days, a girl was quite old enough to get married by that age. Dakin was the prettiest girl in the village. She could sing like a thrush and dance like a leaf in the wind, and besides, she was a marvelous cook. So that, until you know certain other things about her, it's difficult to understand why her parents were so very anxious about her chances of getting married. It had begun 4 years earlier, when she was 10, and had announced to her mother and father and 2 sisters and 2 brothers that she was not going to marry until she had seen some of the things she wanted to see and done some of the things she wanted to do. She went on to tell them that there were 3 main things, which were these. She wanted to visit the farthest away mountain, she wanted to meet a gargoyle, and she wanted to find a prince for her husband. The family was at supper at the time. Her father and mother had looked at each other, and so had her brothers and sisters. Then they all looked at Dakin, who was calmly drinking her soup.
"But Dakin, you can't go to the farthest away mountain,"
said her father.
"No one's ever been there, not even me, and I'm the most traveled man in the village."
"Dakin, what do you want to see a gargoyle for?" scolded her mother. "If you ever saw one, you'd be so frightened you'd turn into a stone." "You're a silly goose," said her elder brother Darcy. Dakin had stopped drinking her soup and was looking out of the window toward the farthest away mountain, which in the clear air looked as if it were just beyond the end of the village. "I must go to the farthest away mountain and see what's in the forest," she said. "And I want to find out what makes the snow change color."
"There's nothing in the forest you won't find in our own pine wood," argued Margol, her second brother, who thought he knew everything. And I can tell you why the snow changes color without going to see. It's the sun shining on it.
Shining blue? Shining green? Said Dakin scornfully. The gargoyle part's silly, though, said her littlest sister Triska, who was only 6. I've seen pictures of them in Pastor's book of church pictures, and they're horrid and ugly. I think they look sad, said Dakin. I want to find one and ask why gargoyles look sad.
They're only statues of heads. They can't talk, scoffed Shaggy with her mouth full. Anyway, she added with some satisfaction, you'll have to give in about the prince. There's only Prince Raleigh, and he can't marry anyone until the Ring of Kings is found.
Which might be any time, said Dakin.
Which will be never, said Margot. It's been missing for 17 years, since it was stolen by a troll at Prince Raleigh's christening, and no one in the royal family can get married without it.
Besides, said Shaggy, what makes you think he'd marry you? He'd want to marry a princess.
But a dreamy look came into her eyes, so that Darcy, who was a tease, said, Look at Shaggy, wishing he'd come and ask her. And they all laughed. Dakin's brothers and sisters forgot what she'd said, and her father and mother hoped Dakin had forgotten too. 4 years went by, and young men began to ask for her hand in marriage. But when her father would tell her that this one or that one had asked for her, Dakin would only shake her head.
It's no good, father, she would say. I've made up my mind to visit the farthest away mountain and see a gargoyle and find a prince to be my husband.
Her father at first tried to reason with her, and later he got angry and shouted, and as time went by, he grew pathetic and pleaded, which was hardest of all for Dakin, who loved him, to resist. But her mind was made up, and somehow she couldn't change it. So now she was nearly 15, and there was hardly a young man in the village who had not asked for her at least once and gone away disappointed. Shaggy and Darcy and Margot were all married, so that left only Triska at home to keep her company. But she seemed quite happy, and usually sang as she did her work around the house. Only sometimes, on her way past a window or across the grass outside the back door, she would stop with a dishcloth or a plate of chicken meal in her hands and look to the left, along the valley, to where the royal estates lay, with the spires, high walls, and shining golden gates of the palace. Then she would turn and look the other way, toward the mountain. She would stand quite still, as if listening. Then she would sigh very deeply before moving on again. Next is Chapter 1. I hope you'll join me later.